My ex and I share two sons, ages 13 and 12. 7 years ago, our relationship ended not with a dramatic explosion, but in the quiet, painful way that things fall apart when two people simply can't make it work anymore. It wasn't a bitter breakup, but it wasn't amicable either. We were two people on opposite paths, and though the love we once shared had dwindled, we both agreed on one thing: our boys deserved the best life we could provide. At the time, I was financially stable. I had a steady job, a modest home, and enough savings to ensure my children would never go without. My ex, on the other hand, was struggling. She was bouncing between jobs, trying to find her footing in a world that often felt too harsh and unyielding. When it came time to discuss custody arrangements, she made a surprising suggestion. I should take full custody of our boys. She argued that they needed stability, structure, and a safe environment, things she couldn't provide. "This is what's best for them," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. Reluctantly, I agreed. It wasn't an easy decision for either of us, but I wanted to believe her intentions were pure, that she genuinely wanted what was best for our children. For the past 7 years, I've been their sole caretaker. My days are filled with school runs, soccer practices, science fairs, and the occasional late-night heart-to-heart. I've watched my boys grow from curious little toddlers into thoughtful, kind, and resilient young men. Their mother, however, has been a sporadic presence at best. She retained visitation rights, but used them infrequently, sometimes going months without so much as a phone call. It hurt more than I care to admit. Not for me, but for them. I saw the confusion in their eyes when they asked why mom didn't show up for the weekend, or why her phone always seemed to go straight to voicemail. I resolved early on not to badmouth her in front of them. I wanted them to form their own opinions about her, without my bitterness clouding their judgment. Instead, I poured all my energy into being both their father and, in many ways, their mother. A few months after our breakup, my ex started dating someone new. He was everything she'd ever wanted: wealthy, charming, and well-connected. He wasn't just a man, he was a promise of a better life. Or so it seemed. He was from overseas, and their whirlwind romance quickly escalated. Within a year, she was pregnant with his child. But there was a catch. There's always a catch. Her boyfriend made it clear that while he loved her, he had no interest in raising baggage from her previous relationship. That baggage was our sons. In his eyes, they were inconvenient reminders of her past, and he wanted no part of them. To accommodate his wishes, she moved 3 hours away. At first, I thought it was a temporary measure, but as weeks turned into months, it became clear that she had essentially cut ties with our boys. For nearly 2 years, she didn't visit, call, or even send birthday cards. It was as though they didn't exist. During those years, I wrestled with a storm of emotions: anger, sadness, disappointment. How could a mother abandon her children so easily? How could she choose a man over the boys who had once been her whole world? But I kept those feelings to myself. My sons didn't need to carry the weight of my resentment. They needed love, stability, and reassurance that they were enough. Over time, the cracks in her new life began to show. The wealth her boyfriend flaunted turned out to be family money, and his conservative relatives weren't thrilled about her or the baby. When they discovered the pregnancy, they cut him off financially. Suddenly, their glamorous life was reduced to the harsh reality of making ends meet. Adding to their struggles, their son was born with developmental issues, requiring expensive care and constant attention. Despite these challenges, my ex became pregnant again. By this point, her relationship with her boyfriend was on shaky ground. A few months into her second pregnancy, he left her. Just like that, he disappeared back to his home country, leaving her alone, 6 months pregnant, with a special needs child and no financial support. Last week, for the first time in months, my phone rang and her name flashed on the screen. Her voice was a mix of desperation and exhaustion. She explained that she and her son were living in a rundown motel and running out of money fast. She asked if she could stay in my lake house. The lake house isn't a mansion, but it's secure and well-maintained, a small property in a gated community about 30 minutes from where she currently resides. It's meant for weekend getaways, not long-term living. I told her no. Her next request was for money just enough to cover her immediate expenses. Again, I said no. That's when the accusations started. She accused me of being cold-hearted, of letting her family suffer when I had the means to help. "You're the father of 2 of my children," she said, her voice rising. "You have a moral obligation to help me." I disagreed. Firmly, my responsibility is to our sons, not to her or her other children. Over the years, I've been their anchor, their provider, their everything. I've done this without significant help from her. She occasionally pays child support, but the amounts are laughably small and inconsistent, barely enough to cover a fraction of their expenses. I reminded her that these were her choices. She chose to abandon our kids for a relationship that ultimately failed. She chose to have more children, despite her unstable circumstances. I didn't make those decisions for her, and I wouldn't clean up the mess they created. The argument escalated, with her throwing every guilt trip in the book my way. "You're punishing me for my mistakes," she said. "You're making my kids suffer because you're bitter." But I wasn't bitter. I was resolute. For years, I'd watched her prioritize her happiness over our son's well-being. I'd picked up the pieces every time she let them down. This wasn't about revenge or punishment. It was about boundaries. My answer was final. I wouldn't entertain any more discussions on the matter unless they directly involved our children. After I hung up, I sat in silence, replaying the conversation in my head. Part of me felt guilty. Despite everything, a small voice inside me whispered, "Should I have helped her?" But then I looked at my sons, my boys, who have thrived despite everything. They've known heartbreak and disappointment, but they've also known unconditional love and support. My focus has always been, and will always be, on them. Their mother made her choices, and now she must live with the consequences. As Foamy's sons are acutely aware of their mother's lack of involvement in their lives, though they've learned to accept it with a maturity that sometimes surprises me. When she does call or visit, which happens maybe 4 or 5 times a year, they are polite but detached, almost as if she were a distant relative rather than their mother. There's a distinct lack of the warm, easy connection they share with me. It's a dynamic that didn't happen overnight. It's the result of years of inconsistent presence and broken promises. As their father, I've always made a conscious effort to shield them from the details of our conflicts. I know too well the damage that can be done when children are pulled into adult issues. I grew up in a household where my parents fought openly, dragging me and my siblings into their drama as unwilling participants. It left deep, invisible scars, ones that still ache in certain moments. I vowed I would never do that to my children. They deserve the chance to grow up without the heavy burden of adult problems weighing them down. Yet, despite my efforts to protect them, I can't help but notice how their mother's absence has subtly shaped their lives. My older son, who is now entering his teenage years, sometimes struggles with trust issues. He hesitates to rely on others, fearing they might let him down, as his mother so often has. My younger son, more curious by nature, occasionally asks questions that are heartbreaking in their simplicity. "Why doesn't mom visit more often?" he'll ask, his wide eyes searching mine for an answer. I always respond as honestly as I can without disparaging her. "Your mom loves you in her own way," I tell him, "but sometimes grown-ups have a hard time showing it." A big part of me feels like this situation is history repeating itself. My ex has a long history of relying on others to bail her out of tough situations, and I was no exception during our relationship. Whether it was financial struggles, emotional support, or simply handling the day-to-day responsibilities of life, the burden often fell squarely on my shoulders. At the time, I didn't see it for what it was. I thought I was being supportive, a good partner. But hindsight has a way of shining a light on things you missed in the moment. Her troubled upbringing likely plays a significant role in her behavior. She grew up in foster care, never knowing her biological family. Her foster home, from what she's told me, was chaotic and unsupportive. She lacked the stable foundation that so many of us take for granted. It's not hard to see how those early experiences shaped her into the person she is today, a person who struggles with responsibility and accountability. While I empathize with the difficulties she's faced, I also believe that her past doesn't excuse her present. She's an adult now, fully capable of making her own choices. And those choices, for better or worse, have led her to this point. When she called me a few weeks ago, her voice was laced with desperation. She explained that she was on the verge of losing her motel room, where she and her young son, my son's half-brother, had been staying. She needed money, she said, to cover the rent and buy food. As much as it hurt to hear the panic in her voice, I knew I couldn't step in. My priority had to be the two boys I was raising, not the woman who had repeatedly shown she couldn't be counted on. When I refused to help, her desperation turned into guilt-tripping. She brought up our sons, arguing that by helping her, I would indirectly be helping them. She even accused me of lacking compassion, painting me as the villain in a story where she was the victim. But I didn't budge. I told her that while I sympathized with her situation, I couldn't allow myself to be manipulated into taking responsibility for her mistakes. I reminded her, as gently as I could, that she was the one who had made the choices that led her here. It wasn't my job to rescue her from the consequences. A few days later, I received an update from a mutual acquaintance. My ex had completely run out of money and attempted to squat in the motel where she'd been staying. The motel staff called the police, who then contacted Child Protective Services. Her young son was taken into CPS custody, and she was left to fend for herself. When I heard the news, I wish I could say I felt vindicated. But the truth is, I just felt sad. Sad for her, sad for her child, and sad for the way things turned out. That night, as I sat in my living room with my sons, I found myself reflecting on the situation. I thought about all the moments that had led us to this point, the fights, the broken promises, the slow unraveling of a relationship that was never as solid as I once believed. I thought about her struggles and the impact they've had on the people around her. And most of all, I thought about my boys, who deserve so much better than the fractured family they've been given. Do I think I made the right decision in refusing to help her? Yes, I do. My primary responsibility is to my two sons, and I've worked hard to give them a stable, loving home. Enabling her behavior wouldn't have solved the underlying issues, it would have only delayed the inevitable. Still, It's hard not to feel a twinge of guilt. I wonder if there was more I could have done, not for her, but for her children. Could I have stepped in sooner? Could I have done something to prevent her son from ending up in CPS custody? But then I remind myself that I'm only one person. I can't fix everything, and I can't save someone who isn't willing to save themselves. This experience has reinforced the importance of setting boundaries. It's not easy, especially when the person on the other side is someone you once cared about. But sometimes, the best way to help someone is to let them face the consequences of their actions. It's a painful lesson, but a necessary one. Since that phone call, life has returned to its usual rhythm in our household. My older son is busy with his schoolwork and extracurricular activities, while my younger son continues to pepper me with questions about the world. Their laughter fills the house, a constant reminder of what truly matters. I can't change the past, and I can't control their mother's actions, but I can control how I respond. I can choose to be the steady, reliable presence they need. Every so often, I catch myself wondering what the future holds for my ex and her youngest son. Will she find a way to turn her life around? Will he grow up to forgive her for the choices she's made? I don't have the answers, and maybe I never will. All I know is that I'll be here for my boys, doing everything I can to ensure they grow up feeling loved, valued, and secure. As parents, we're often faced with difficult decisions, ones that test our resolve and challenge our sense of what's right and wrong. This was one of those decisions. And while it wasn't easy, I believe it was the right one. My sons deserve a father who is present, dependable, and strong enough to make the tough calls. They deserve a life that isn't overshadowed by the mistakes of the past. And that's exactly what I intend to give them. Army, I'll continue to do what I've always done, put my sons first. They deserve nothing less.